Hello and welcome to the British History Channel with me, Philippa Lacey, and to our latest historian interview. We are way over the 50 mark now of historian interviews, so there's loads to go back and have a look at if you haven't seen them all. So if this is your first time here, welcome. If you love British history, you're definitely in the right place. Like I say, over 50 historian interviews to look at, as well as plenty of live playbacks and sort of mini documentaries that I've done as well. And I have a load in the pipeline of on-location interviews, which I've done, which are in editing and will be coming out over the next few months. So please do subscribe so that you get notifications when a new video goes live. But today, like I say, is another historian interview. I am being joined by Dr. Elizabeth Norton. She is a historian specialising in the Queens of England, the Tudor period more specifically. She has a first class degree from the University of Cambridge, a master's degree from the University of Oxford, and a PhD from King's College London. You may also recognise Elizabeth from television. She's been the historical consultant on many TV series and films, as well as appearing herself on screen in multiple documentaries. It is also her third appearance on the British History Channel. So in 2022, she was here talking about an Anglo-Saxon queen. The topic of her book, Elfrida, was actually a queen called Elfrith, for reasons that we go into in that interview. So you can go back and have a look at that. And actually, she was with me only a few months ago at Harvington History Festival, where we were talking about the gunpowder plot. So you may recognise her already from that. So without further ado, let's welcome Elizabeth to the British History podcast and YouTube channel. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome back to the British History podcast. Twice, actually, this year. This is the second time this year.
It is. Everyone will be getting sick of me. Thank you so much for having me on.
No, you're more than welcome. Well, we're talking about a completely different topic to the last time we were together, which was gunpowder plot. And this time we're talking about the subject of your latest book, which is Women Who Ruled the World, 5,000 years of history of female monarchy. So we've got quite a breadth of topics that we could look at. So, but I want to start with a sort of more general, I suppose, point, and that is I'm interested to know around the difficulties of actually finding out information about these women, because you were very kind and invited me to your book launch, and I think one of the things you were talking about there was how actually some of the evidence, when it was uncovered, about female rule, actually was thought, oh, well, that wasn't a woman then, or it wasn't a king then, because those two things don't come together. Can you talk a bit about that challenge?
Yeah. So, I actually have a whole chapter on people who are clearly reigning queens, but for one reason or the other didn't get identified as reigning queens. And the classic example is the one I did at the book launch is Merneith. So Flinders Petrie, the great archaeologist, was digging at Abydos in Egypt in the 1900 season and found this wonderful tomb. It's got a wooden ceiling, which is really, really rare. It's got 41 sacrificed servants, which sounds pretty unpleasant, is pretty unpleasant, but of course also shows the status of the occupant. It's a really, really lavish tomb. And he went, yep, this is definitely the fifth pharaoh of the first dynasty. And then he looked a bit closer at the stele and went, oh, it's a woman, not a pharaoh. And just, that was it. So looks like a pharaoh. As far as we can tell, she acts like a pharaoh. She's also on king lists. In her own son's tomb, there are actually some king lists, and she's on them, and on a few other early king lists as well. But simply because she's a woman, she just got removed. It was just, they couldn't countenance the idea of there being a female pharaoh in the first dynasty. And that's really, really common with reigning queens. They get characterized as regents a lot, even though often there isn't a king, in fact. Another really good example is Marguerite I of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. She's an absolute titan of the medieval period, probably the most powerful woman in medieval Europe. And her title is she conquers Sweden, which kind of gives you a sense of how powerful this woman is. And there's all these kind of sources going, that's really embarrassing for the king of Sweden because he's been conquered by a woman. How embarrassing. But her title, she's not queen. Her title is husband, so she's the husband of her kingdom. She's a husband of Denmark. She's a husband of Norway. She's a husband of Sweden. For most of her reign, there isn't another monarch, because she does bring in a great nephew towards the end of her reign as a kind of junior co-ruler, but really she's ruling. But for most of the time, there isn't a king. So if there isn't, if she's not the monarch, who is the monarch? And what's really interesting with her actually is, of course, now she's Marguerite the First, and she's very much recognised as a queen. But that actually only happened in 1972, when Margareta became Queen of Denmark, having had to have a major change in the succession, because when she was born, she had no claim because she was female. But when she became queen, she said, "I'm going to be Margareta the Second," and everyone went, "Who's the first then?" So it promoted, I mean, they make a big thing of it in Denmark. They say, they got two queens that day because they got Margareta the Second, but they also got Marguerite the First.
So she knew her history.
She did. And it's actually a pretty feminist statement, I would say, choosing the second as a regnal number. I like Margareta. She's fascinating. Although she did abdicate while I was writing the book, which was very selfish of her, actually, because I wanted to end with Margareta as, one of the world's only reigning queens, and then she abdicated.
Oh, oh well. Other things to do. I don't know.
Yes.
So you mentioned Egypt there. So let's talk about possibly one of the most famous rulers of the world ever, generally known as Cleopatra. She was actually Cleopatra the Seventh, of the Ptolemy dynasty. So talk to us about the way she ruled, because she actually doesn't rule on her own, does she? She co-rules, but then there's her co-ruler changes for various
Yes.
reasons over time. So is there a dominant half? Is she it? And if so, what's their role?
Yeah. So the Ptolemaic dynasty, which is a Greek dynasty that rules Egypt, it's their last dynasty. They're quite good on female power. I mean, the Ptolemies are awful people, awful people, including sort of cutting up princes and sending them to their mothers and things like that. But they're quite good on female power. So although not all of the Cleopatras are reigning queens, most of them, the regnal numbers are more for kind of ease to try and sort them out. Some of them definitely are. And Cleopatra II, Cleopatra III, they're definitely reigning queens. And you often get a sense of dual monarchy. So you'll have a man and a woman on the throne. And this is what we see with Cleopatra. So she rules, first of all, with one brother. They sort of have a falling out. He dies. She then marries another brother, or possibly marry. I mean, she probably does marry these brothers, but there's no actual records, but it would be expected that she would. But she rules with her second brother. She then removes him from the throne and rules with her son, Caesarion, as this co-rule. So she's never actually able to rule alone. And I think that's really worth bringing out with Cleopatra. We think about her as this incredibly powerful, dominant reigning queen, but she's actually never in a secure enough position where she can do away with a man. She has to have a male co-ruler, albeit that she is very much the dominant ruler. And she's the one who's able to remove these various kings and impose her will, but not entirely unfettered. When she falls from power, Caesarion, her son, is on the brink of adulthood. So she may well have had something of a challenge from her son for reigning. That's quite common in the Ptolemaic dynasty. They often kill each other. Her father had her elder sister executed, for example, because her elder sister stole the throne while he was in Rome. So she's interesting because we have this vision of her as this really powerful and independent queen, but she actually, I would say, she has a real male relative problem, which a lot of queens have, which is that she's always forced to kind of negotiate with the men in her life, and there is a sense that as a woman, it's more difficult.
And so she kind of needs that, even if they're just there in name, but then they're never going to want to just be there in name. So then that gives the difficulties of that.
Yeah, it's also complicated by she has a sister, Arsinoe the Fourth, who at one stage makes a bid for the throne and then goes off with one of her brothers and attempts to become queen. So I mean, they're a complicated family, but yeah, she is the dominant ruler, but that she isn't. She isn't a powerful and independent ruler in the sense that Elizabeth I is, for example. There are checks on her power, and it comes from these male co-rulers.
Let's fast forward now to 18th century Russia and another queen who deposed a king. Tell us about this. So this is Catherine the Great seizes power from her husband, Peter III. How does she do that? What's the attitude to female power in Russia at that point?
So Interesting. I mean, Russia, the 18th century, at least the last three quarters of it, is almost entirely female ruled in Russia, which is really interesting. And it begins with Peter the Great at the start of the 18th century, the great sort of enlightened emperor who tried to drag Russia into Europe and into kind of the modern world, including sort of making everyone cut their beards off and things like that. But he married his mistress, who's actually a Livonian peasant who he'd had several children with, but then he married her. And when he died, he hadn't named a successor, which he'd said that he would do. And because he crowned his second wife as empress, it was decided that that probably meant that she was the heir to the throne. So Catherine I, who's Peter the Great's widow, is kind of parachuted onto the throne. She only reigns for a couple of years. She's not particularly effective. It's kind of almost a continuation of Peter the Great's reign, but it does kind of give a sense that Russia can have a reigning empress.
Mm.
She's succeeded by Peter's grandson from his son by his first marriage. But then on the grandson's death, Anna, who is Peter's niece, is chosen as empress. So we then have another reigning empress, and she rules for a while, rules quite effectively. She then selects her great nephew who's a baby, as the heir, with his mother Anna Leopoldovna ruling as regent. So again, although she's not a reigning empress, she's pretty powerful. And then in the middle of the night, Peter the Great and Catherine I's daughter, Elizaveta, basically puts on a breastplate and marches into the palace and wakes up Anna Leopoldovna and says, I'm the empress now, and sends them all off to prison. So Elizaveta is a real force and very much Catherine the Great's political mentor. She is Catherine's aunt-in-law. She sends for her nephew, Peter, the future Peter III, to come and be heir to the throne. He's German, in fact. His mother was Russian but died in childbirth, just after childbirth. And so he's German, effectively. Elizaveta arranges for Peter to marry Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, who is a German princess who takes the baptismal name as Catherine. And whereas Peter remains resolutely German, dresses in German military uniforms, doesn't really learn Russian, isn't very fond of the Orthodox Church, Catherine the Great, the future Catherine the Great, really embraces being Russian. She learns Russian. She becomes very, openly Orthodox and really kind of builds these networks, which Peter never does. I mean, she's horrible about Peter in her memoirs. Obviously she's not unbiased.
Mm.
But he comes across as an absolute nightmare. He's childish. He's playing with toys when he's sort of 20. He's just an idiot, really. In Catherine's betrayal, there have been attempts made to rehabilitate Peter to some extent. But Catherine learns from Elizaveta. And when Elizaveta dies, Peter becomes emperor. And it's quite clear he's going to divorce Catherine. They don't get on. So she's built this party. And she, again, like Elizaveta, she gets up in the night, puts on military uniform and rides into the city and is proclaimed as empress. When Peter tries to get into one of his fortresses later that day, he calls out, "Let me in, I'm the emperor." And someone calls out, "We don't have an emperor in Russia, we've got an empress." So he's arrested. He then dies of hemorrhoids, which
Oh,
isn't really a fatal condition. I mean, I think he's possibly the only person in the world to have died of hemorrhoids. So I think it's very much in inverted commas. I mean, Catherine was known as Catherine Slazar in enlightened circles in England. I mean, I think it's probably true. But yeah, so she basically comes to power in the force of her personality and the force of, her Russianness. She's got no claim to the throne. She's not Russian. She's a very minor German royal. She shouldn't be empress, but they almost don't care. She's just built herself up. It's all sort of propaganda, moves in the right circles, but she's very, very impressive.
I actually hadn't realised that she wasn't even Russian. Do we see women being more aggressive than men sometimes in order to assert it, or are they just as aggressive as the men, or is there any difference?
So it's really variable, and I get asked this a lot. And I think generally people think that there will be women will be gentler than men. And to some extent, it can be true. I mean, Elizabeth I was quite reluctant to go to war, for example. Partly that was a money thing, though. I mean, she was quite keen on money and didn't really want to spend the money on war. Some of the queens are incredibly aggressive. I mean, Irene of Athens, who's a Byzantine empress, actually has her son blinded so that she can take the throne, which is pretty extreme. I mean, in the context of the Byzantine Empire, it's not that extreme. That's what you do to a political opponent. You mutilate them so that you don't have to kill them, but they can't take the throne anymore. There are many examples of fathers doing it to their children in the Byzantine Empire and other parts of the world as well. So it looks bad, but in the context, it's not that bad compared to, what's going on. But yeah, so I mean, I would say in general, women rulers aren't more gentle than men, but they also probably aren't particularly more aggressive. I think in all cases they do what's necessary or what they can attempt to. I mean, in the book I've got a case where a queen is killed by her own father, most likely. And also, of course, Cleopatra's father has his daughter executed. So, men also do horrible things to these women. So no, I would say most women who are reigning queens don't succeed, and that was very obvious in the book. But there are some who are stunning successes, including Catherine the Great. So you do get a real diversity. But yeah, I mean, Catherine's not necessarily more aggressive. I mean, Peter might well have had her killed. Elisabetta, actually, her aunt-in-law, famously said she wouldn't execute anyone during her reign, and she didn't. Although she did have people's tongues cut out and things like that, so she wasn't.
Yeah. So there was a lot. It sounds like there's a lot of kill or be killed.
Yeah, I mean, it's dog eat dog, really,
Mm.
until the 19th century. Really, globally, it's yeah. If you want to be a reigning queen, you do have to. You are held to different standards, and often it's much harder. I mean, there's this wonderful quote that's attributed to Ginger Rogers that is, about dancing with Fred Astaire, that she had to do the same as him, but she does it backwards and in high heels. And I think that really applies to these queens, that they're doing the same as men, but it's so much harder. Really, till the 50s, at least the 1950s, I'd say.
So you said there, the successful women, the ones maybe with some of these, obviously people will have heard of, and there's lots in your book that they won't have done. It's great that that your book highlights them. But did you find evidence then of women trying to take control and not being able to?
Oh, yeah, many. I mean, Mary Queen of Scots is a really good example. I mean, she's quite effective in her sole rule in Scotland. Unfortunately, she marries Henry Lord Darnley, mm, and the husband of a queen is a king, of course. So Henry Lord Darnley becomes King Henry of Scots. He's on the coins, he's on all the documents. So, actually, in a lot of examples I've found, actually, it's a real problem if you have close male relatives. If you're a reigning queen, Elizabeth I is quite lucky that she doesn't have any close male relatives. And a really good example is Blanca II of Navarre, who's a 15th century queen. She inherits the throne. Her mother had been the reigning queen of Navarre, and was married to Juan II of Aragon, who's actually the father of Ferdinand of Aragon, so Catherine of Aragon's grandfather. But she's married to Juan, who's the king consort of Navarre, and he doesn't want to give up power. So when Blanca becomes queen, she's basically imprisoned by him and probably murdered a few years later. She dies very suddenly. And then his younger daughter, Leonor, basically has to wait till he dies to be able to become Queen of Navarre. She has her coronation and she dies about 2 weeks later, which is really unlucky. But I think, I mean, actually, Juan's son by his second wife, Ferdinand of Aragon, I think he probably learnt from his father's example, because of course he imprisons his own daughter Juana on grounds of her insanity. Whether or not that's true, I think it's certainly debatable whether that's true. But poor Juana spends 50 years in prison simply because she is the reigning queen of Spain.
Mm. Yeah, all these stories that have come down to us about insanity or some way being unfit to rule, and on re-examination, well, who told us that? Oh, the
Yeah.
person who benefited.
It's really common, and it's such a way of removing difficult females to say they're hysterical or they are insane. And because how can you prove you're not? I mean, actually, you probably sound a bit hysterical when you go, "Well, I'm not insane." you know,
Yeah.
it's, yeah, it's a really good way to remove a difficult female rival, and they do take it.
Now, you mentioned Mary Queen of Scots there. Now, she famously, I suppose, becomes queen at 6 days old. And throughout history, countries with a child monarch, there's the difficulties that come with that. Are there Is it the same whether the child is a boy or a girl, or are there any particular difficulties if the child monarch is a girl?
So in general, it's worse because at least until probably 18th century, there's an expectation that princesses will go off to get married. I mean, that's certainly what Henry VIII had in mind with the rough wooing for Mary Queen of Scots. He was intending to bring baby Mary south to be raised in England. Um, and that's what people expect. Of course, she's raised in France because she's going to be queen consort of France. Someone else will be ruling Scotland for her. So there's a real danger you're going to lose your monarch. It happens in Jerusalem as well with Isabella II, who's actually younger than Mary when she becomes queen, insanely, because her mother died in childbirth and was the reigning queen herself. Isabella is married to the Holy Roman Emperor and is spirited away to Sicily, where she dies in childbirth again when she's 16. But she's not, he goes to Jerusalem by himself to be crowned. He doesn't need, once he's married her, he doesn't even need her to have her presence. So you do risk losing your queen. Conversely, one advantage, and this is what the Kingdom of Jerusalem very much found, the Latin Kingdom, because they have a whole run of reigning queens, and a couple of them are children, Maria and then Isabella II. Actually, it does give you the opportunity to choose your own king to some extent. Because actually they basically select who they want to rule and make them marry the queen. So that's kind of one small advantage of child rulers. But in general, child queens they're at a double disadvantage because they're children, which is always bad, and they are female. Even the most recent reigning female child monarch, who's Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, who becomes queen aged 10 in 1890, there was a great deal of concern about her succession. It wasn't clear that her mother would be regent, which also happened with Mary Queen of Scots, of course. Her mother wasn't initially regent. So even in more recent times, it's still quite difficult to have a reigning queen as a child. So yeah, I would say they are the most unfortunate of any reigning queens, really. And it's very, very difficult to establish yourself as an adult and independent monarch if you start in childhood.
So is there any differences between the countries that have, you've mentioned a few now that have had actually a succession of female monarchs. Is there anything that you could see that's fundamentally different about the way they're set up or their culture that means that they were more open to that?
Yeah. So most countries, and this is global, and really until at least the 1950s, most countries don't want a reigning queen. And that's almost universal. There are only really two polities that I would say were actually welcoming queens. One is the Kingdom of Kush in modern Sudan and northern Ethiopia, which has a whole run of reigning Kandakes who are queens in the classical period. And they are clearly seeking out female rule, which is very unusual. They're very much presented in militaristic terms, big, powerful women on their monuments. The other one is the reign queens of the Balabado in South Africa. And that kingdom is still, well, actually it's a queendom, and it's recognized as a queendom in South Africa's constitution, actually. Although they actually, the last reign queen died in 2005, and they were waiting with a regent for her daughter to grow up. Her daughter was an infant to be crowned. And then just before she turned 18, the regent announced he was going to crown her brother instead. So that's all going through the South African courts at the moment. So even a queendom might end up with a king. But in general, nowhere wants a queen. And that's really obvious. And we can see it in Tudor England, of course. It's Henry VIII is desperate not to end up with a queen on the throne. Nowhere wants a queen. Isabel of Castile is a really powerful reigning queen, but she doesn't really want to be succeeded by her daughter. It's a bit of a disaster. However, most places around the world will accept a queen if it's a last resort. So there are a few exceptions to that. France never has a reigning queen. That's partly to do with the fact that in 1316 they come quite close to having a reigning queen, well, they kind of should have had a reigning queen, but she was 4 years old, possibly illegitimate, and so it was quite easy to step over her. And after that, they kind of found a rationale for why she'd been stepped over and why Edward III of England couldn't be king of France, who claimed for a woman. They found the Salic law, which the Salic law really doesn't ban female inheritance. If you read the Salic law, it's mostly talking about the theft of bees and things like that, but it really doesn't ban female inheritance. It's very much a fudging, a retrofitting, but of course became really important across Europe, particularly France. But otherwise, most people will take a reigning queen. Women tend to come at the end of dynasties, and they're not the cause of the end of dynasty. They're a symptom of it, because actually if a dynasty is in crisis, you might end up with a woman. And you see that in Egypt, you see that in Europe, you see that across the world, in the Mexican Empire, for example. So yeah, nobody really wants one. And that's actually still, it's not the case anymore. Most places have changed most kingdoms, at least in Europe, have changed their succession now to allow absolute primogeniture, so the eldest child becomes monarch. Not everywhere. Spain hasn't. So Leonor, who's the heiress to Spain, could be supplanted by a baby brother. She probably won't be, but she could be. But in general, it's queens are more welcome now. But actually, even Elizabeth II's accession there was some concern about having a queen. And Margareta II, of course, wasn't heir to the throne when she was born in I think 1940, and that's really quite recent. So
Mm.
yeah, in general, then we're a patriarchal species, and that was really obvious in my research for the book.
On that then, do the women who become monarchs, and I suppose I'm thinking further back in history, but do they see themselves as exceptional, as something different to a quote unquote ordinary female?
Yeah, that's really obviously. Being a reigning queen doesn't mean you're a feminist. I mean, Elizabeth I isn't a feminist. She doesn't promote women. She doesn't really do anything for the condition of women. She's just, she definitely considers she has the right to rule, but she's very much this exceptional woman. I may have the body but of a weak and feeble woman. That kind of thing. And you see that Isabel of Castile probably considers herself to be really exceptional. I mean, she actually takes the throne from her niece in the War of the Castilian Succession. So she's clearly not a huge advocate for sort of women's rights. And obviously, talking about feminism going back in the past, you can't really do that. Although, actually, I mean, there are a few examples where female rulers do improve the lot of women. Wu Zetian, who's the only Chinese empress, who's a fabulous, quite scary, but she reigns in the 7th century. She's the daughter of a lumber merchant and sort of manages to become emperor of China, which kind of suggests that she's quite powerful. She basically marries the emperor and then eventually declares that she's going to be empress when she's 70, actually. But she actually does improve things for women in China. She's clearly quite interested in women's rights. I mean, again, that's a bit anachronistic, but for example, she employs women, so female secretaries, things like that. She also actually changes the law. So she increases the mourning period for when your mother dies to the same as for your father, which is quite revolutionary in 7th century China. So some women do try to improve the position of women, but most female rulers don't, and possibly wouldn't have the power to do it. I mean, in many respects, it's kind of bad enough already that there's a woman on the throne, but if you then start getting women cabinet ministers and, women judges and things, that might be a step too far for people. So in general, they support themselves.
I mean, it obviously changes. I mean, I was 11 before I realised that it wasn't women who ruled, because we had Queen Elizabeth on the throne and Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. So to me, until I was at secondary school, I was like, oh, right, okay.
Yeah,
This is something that isn't that normal, that usual.
but it is. I
Excuse
mean,
me.
Margaret Thatcher's only the 5th female prime minister, which is quite mad when you think she comes to power in the late 70s. She's
Mm.
the first European female prime minister as well. It goes Sri Lanka, Israel, India. I may have got those the wrong way around. They're quite similar. I think it's Israel and India, and then Central African Republic. And then it is Margaret Thatcher, and then Portugal.
It's not countries you would necessarily think
No,
of.
and actually, if you look at female presidents today, they're a diverse group, sort of spread around the world, which is really, really good to see.
Mm.
Although it's still only around 10% of presidencies that have a woman. So, there's more work to be done.
One of the queens, I was just thinking of them when you were saying about women's rights and not being particularly feminist. Queen Victoria came to my mind.
Queen Victoria is a classic example of a woman who's very much not a feminist. Actually, the reason lesbianism wasn't illegal in Britain in the same way that, being homosexual as a man was until horrifically recently, actually,
Mm.
is because Queen Victoria didn't believe it was possible. She's like, no, women wouldn't do that. So
Because, of course, she was famously sex mad. She probably just did like, well, why? What? No, that's not.
I mean, she liked boys, really. Well, men, yeah, she liked men.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Very keen on men.
So with her, does her the way she is, and also her retreat from public life. So, I mean, obviously, she gives birth 9 times, and then when Albert dies, she famously sort of just goes off grid completely for a year or so. Does that change the power structure? Like, does that actually change how the country is governed?
Not hugely. So over here, she's a constitutional monarch. She's not a constitutional monarch in India, however. She's an absolute monarch there, albeit that she rules through viceroys. But so it doesn't a huge amount. She is more powerful than Charles III is, for example. I mean, Queen Victoria in the UK still has quite a lot of power, but she is a constitutional monarch. So she was still meeting with her prime ministers and her governments, but kind of, not performing the public role of monarch. So I think that was more of a problem, the fact that she wasn't appearing. And you get a growing Republican movement. The late Victorian period, mid Victorian period isn't, particularly great time for a lot of people. There's a lot of poverty in the UK and in Ireland, and actually, she was incredibly unpopular. I mean, there was talks of republicanism. There was talks of requiring her to abdicate. Um, so she did have to come out of the shell, but I think it didn't massively impact on her power. Um, she was quite a powerful woman, again, particularly in India, actually. But I think when she did come out of her shell, this is when we kind of get the legend of Queen Victoria. I mean, Albert's death was actually a good thing for Queen Victoria. She doesn't know this, but it was a good thing for Queen Victoria because he was very much trying to take over power. And he was he's fairly awful to her at times, really kind of zapping her confidence and, basically trying to take power when actually, he shouldn't really have been anywhere near the dispatch boxes.
Yeah.
So she comes out of her shell and emerges as confident and very powerful ruler. And, obviously she's very much tarnished by empire. And I think, that's
Mm.
something people increasingly come to realize. And she's enthusiastic about empire. I think she's also quite naive. She loves India. I mean, she genuinely loves India. She never goes there, but she genuinely loves India. She learns the languages. Yeah, so she learns Hindi. Is it Hindi? Maybe Urdu. Sorry, it's gone from my head. But, it has Indian servants. She styles some of her rooms in Indian style, but it's very much a kind of rose-tinted glasses look. She's not really seeing, what's actually going on.
Mm.
But she's a fascinating woman, Victoria. She's in 2 chapters in the book, as British monarch and also as Indian monarch.
Wonderful. So people can read more about the the complex woman that Victoria was in your book. And I mean, you obviously mentioned empire there. I mean, colonial expansion has got rid of many monarchies. And you write about the last queen of Hawaii. Um, did her gender, excuse me, have anything to do you think, with the American conquest of Hawaii?
No, I mean, I think they thought that they would have a more pliable ruler. So Liliuokalani came to the throne on the death of her brother. So her brother, she was actually in London when her brother was forced to agree to what's called the Bayonet Constitution, which is was created by the US settlers. And Hawaii had a lot of US settlers throughout the 19th century. It had huge sugar plantations, and there's always this kind of vying for power. The Bayonet Constitution gives a lot more power to the US settlers, and I mean it's called the Bayonet Constitution, which gives you a sense of how freely this was agreed to by King Kalakaua. So she comes back to Hawaii from London. She'd been visiting Queen Victoria, actually, which is really interesting with the 19th century queens, that they know each other.
Mm.
But he then takes himself off to America, King Kalakaua, to try to sort out the Bayonet Constitution. And then when he dies, she becomes queen. And I think there's a real sense that they think she's a woman, she's a middle-aged woman, she'll be easy to deal with. And actually she isn't. So in her first cabinet meeting, according to the Bayonet Constitution, she really should just say, yep, you're all cabinet ministers. She's not really supposed to appoint her own cabinet. And she simply goes, nope, I want you all to resign, and then I will reappoint you if I want to do it. So immediately the US powers really think, oh, she's a problem. And she is. I mean, in the Hawaiian archives, there are draft constitutions in Liliuokalani's own handwriting, where she's trying to create a new constitution for Hawaii. And it's quite innocuous. I mean, it's based on the US Constitution, of course. It's just it's much fairer to the Hawaiian people who are quite disenfranchised by the Bayonet Constitution. But obviously this is pretty unacceptable to the settlers. And eventually there's a coup against her. And actually then a US ship brings their troops in to protect the settlers, but actually depose the queen. And she's locked up for over a year. And then sort of takes herself off to Washington and attempts to get her crown back, but never succeeds. So no, I don't think her sex really did play a part in that. I think they thought she'd be more pliable. So in some respects, had she been a bit more of a traditional Victorian woman, she might have been more successful, because she probably wouldn't have been removed from power. She could have continued as a fairly fairly powerless reigning queen.
Mm.
But it's actually the fact that she is so dynamic that she becomes such a problem that actually she is removed. And ultimately, of course, Hawaii becomes first a US colony and then a US state eventually.
Mm. Your book begins with the public's reaction to the death of Elizabeth II in 2022. What kind of monarch was Elizabeth II? And do you think there are lessons from her reign that future monarchies could learn?
Yeah, I mean, she's the longest reigning female monarch that we know of, and probably is the longest reigning female monarch. There's certainly no indication that anyone, only Victoria came close, of course. So that in itself is quite remarkable. She was a really impressive monarch, and I think she's all the more impressive because of, the fact that actually she came to the throne in 1952. And when you look at early photos of her with heads of government, heads of the Commonwealth states, she's always the only woman in the photo. Occasionally, the Queen Mother's in them, actually, slightly randomly. But in general, it's just Elizabeth II, just this one woman. And that continues. There'd never been a female prime minister anywhere in the world before Elizabeth's reign. And I'm not saying that she causes that. I think that would be a stretch. But actually, she's a real anomaly still. And I think we tend to forget that because we're looking back from a position where there are female presidents, although the first woman to be directly elected as a president was only 1980. Isabel Perón was a little bit earlier, but she was in Argentina, but she was promoted from vice president.
Mm.
So, even it's still quite recent female power, but I think we should understand more how impressive it was that Elizabeth II managed to establish herself and, kind of get an independent voice and independent status, because actually there was unease about having a reigning queen. Not as much as there would have been, with Elizabeth I and Mary I, or, back centuries before. But there's certainly, it wasn't seen as ideal. And I think what's really interesting, of course, is, the final photo of her is swearing in a female prime minister. Okay, that's Liz Truss. It didn't go very well, but it's still quite impressive in itself, because that's not something I think she would have envisaged in 1952. If you said to her, your last photo will be swearing in a prime minister, I don't think she would have thought it would be a woman. I mean, that would have been very implausible. So I think she was really impressive, and I think in many respects was a trailblazer for women's rights, because she was the most famous face in the world, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think before she died, I think she was someone almost everyone in the world would recognize and know who she was. And I don't think you can say that about anybody else in the world. I mean, maybe Donald Trump at the moment, but not really. But she was, everyone knew who she was.
Mm.
And as you say, and I'm the same, I grew up, when I was a kid, it was Margaret Thatcher and Elizabeth II. I kind of just thought women were in charge. But of course, they're not normally, and they're still not. So I think that's why she's really important. And I think future female monarchs particularly should take note of her example. And I think they very much will.
And of course, the UK was one of the places that you mentioned who have altered the line of succession rules, which make it pure primogeniture, which won't actually kick in unless
Yeah.
George has a daughter first. But the
Yeah,
rule
so
is
it's a
there.
start. It's a start. It was kind of a shame George was a boy.
Because she
Which
did it
sounds
just
awful.
before. She did it before he was
Yeah.
born, didn't she?
Which
So
is
if
a better way to do it, because Sweden did it the other way around. So Crown Princess Victoria is the heir to Sweden, but when she was about 2, her baby brother was born, so he became the Crown Prince. And then they changed the law when her brother was around 1 year old to make her Crown Princess again and to have absolute primogeniture. But it was really controversial. And probably they should have done it before a boy was born, actually, because of course he'll always be, the ex-Crown Prince, actually. So I think it was the right thing to do, but probably should have got that done a bit earlier.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a great book, and I think everyone will thoroughly enjoy reading it or listening to it, because you did the audible, haven't you?
I did.
You did.
I had to
How was
practice
that
some of the
experience?
pronunciation. Yeah. So there are a lot of names that I practiced a lot, actually. So, I'd be doing it. I'd go, right, I'm just going to practice this. And then I'd go, yes. And then Terry Maver Varua.
Make it sound very natural. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And where else can people find you?
So I'm on social media. I'm always Norton History, which is nice and easy to find, hopefully. Although there is an Elizabeth Norton who I think gets tagged as me quite often. Actually, we follow each other now. But so I'm Norton History. I've also recently joined TikTok, although I've only got about 50 followers. So if anyone wants to follow me, I would feel a bit less unpopular.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, absolutely wonderful. Thank you.